Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I'm Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together, we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. And as we often do on this program, we are going to start with a daily distraction. We seem to be going with a space theme, which does fit our logo and does fit the name of the show, Liberty Starship. But this time, I'm not going to talk directly about SpaceX. Instead, I'm actually going to talk about one of their competitors and some news that they recently made. So this is an ad from the Reuters news service. It says Rocket Lab vehicle fails to reach orbit, loses payload of satellites. It says a rocket from small satellite launch firm Rocket Lab failed to reach orbit minutes after a successful liftoff from New Zealand on Saturday, the company said, losing its payload of 7 small satellites it intended to carry to space. An issue was experienced today during Rocket Lab's launch that caused the loss of the vehicle, the company said on Twitter, adding more information will be shared as available. We are deeply sorry to the customers on board Electron, the Auckland, New Zealand-based company said. The issue occurred late in the flight during the second stage burn. Rocket Lab is one of a growing group of launch companies looking to slash the cost of sending shoebox-sized satellites to low Earth orbit, building smaller rockets and reinventing traditional production lines to meet a growing payload demand. Said the rocket's altitude peaked at 121 miles, roughly 7 minutes after liftoff before quickly decreasing, according to in-flight telemetry on the company's live video feed. It was aiming to send 5 tiny Earth imaging satellites from Planet Labs, 1 microsatellite from Canon Electronics, and a CubeSat from British company In Space Missions into sun-synchronous orbit 310 miles above Earth. So, Pete, this is the first time I have actually heard of this company called Rocket Lab. I was not familiar with it. Had you heard of this company before?
No, I've heard of SpaceX and I've heard of Virgin Galactic, but this one is a new one for me.
Yeah, I actually had not heard of them either. I did see a article previously about another competitor in Japan a couple weeks ago that also had a failed launch. So it's interesting from the perspective that it seems to be that we're seeing more and more private companies that are sort of getting into this private space race. And I haven't really seen a lot of coverage of that term that way. But it does seem to me that there's a lot of private companies out there right now that are trying to emulate the success of SpaceX and are trying to sort of do their own thing. Like this particular company, it sounds like they're putting very, very small rockets into orbit, or at least they're trying to, because apparently they failed in this attempt. And to be fair, SpaceX has failed in some of their attempts as well. But of course, they have I think, a fairly impressive track record at this point, especially with the big benchmark of recently putting some American astronauts into space aboard the International Space Station. But that mission actually isn't over yet. We still haven't had those astronauts return. But it'll be interesting to see the future of these companies as they start to get better and they start to become more competitive to SpaceX and what we might see in terms of the privatization of space and of space exploration.
This company is about 14 years old. So it's not like this is brand new, which was kind of what I expected since we haven't heard of it before. I thought we'd find that it was just funded a few years ago and this was their first launch. Does it mention their track record of attempting to get to space before this?
I don't believe this particular article gets into a lot of their. No, it doesn't actually. In fact, there's only one more paragraph to what I actually read. It's a very brief article just to chronicle the failure of this particular launch. But to kind of dovetail on your point, I remember even as a kid, there were some companies that were experimenting with putting very small satellites into Earth orbit. But that was something that was already happening, and we're talking 30 years ago, something like that. So yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, this isn't a new thing. But I think it is gaining a lot more prominence because of the success of SpaceX, also with their Starlink project, because they are putting a lot of small satellites into orbit now.
That's interesting. So they're thinking that they'll be more successful if they take it in smaller pieces rather than more bigger, more spectacular projects.
Right. This particular launch, they said that it's shoebox size satellites. They're very small. They're like considered. I think they call them microsatellites. Actually, they're very very small.
Wow, it's hard to
So
believe that something that small could even be stable, like it'd be able to power itself. That's just crazy.
it is, isn't
Uh,
it? And that's kind of
yeah.
the age that we're living in now.
Wow, that is amazing.
Now, I do have several news briefs that I wanted to talk about because we do have quite a bit of sort of breaking news today. And so I do kind of have to pick and choose here what it is that I want to um, lead off with here. I'm just getting the screen there. Um, so let's start off the bat because I don't think either one you and I this really is breaking, and neither you or I have a lot of information on this. But this just came out, and it is definitely relevant. So the Supreme Court has come out with a decision, and this is from Kyle Cheney from the Politico. It says breaking Supreme Court upholds state ability to enforce electors' pledges to the candidate who wins the statewide popular vote. In other words, faithless electors are likely a thing of the past. And he has a little quote here. It says, held, a state may enforce an elector's pledge to support his party's nominee and the state voters' choice for president. Again, this is really breaking news. It's just like literally just happened, and I know you haven't had a chance to really digest the decision, nor have I. But I'm curious what your opinion is on faithless electors, Pete. Pete, I think you have your mic muted. Pete, your mic is still muted. I can see it on the. It appears that we have lost Pete for a second here. I think we're just having some technical problems. When we were off the air, we were mentioning that we were seeming to have some technical problems here. Pete, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. At first, it looked like your mic was just muted.
Right. So I would say that on one hand, the Constitution doesn't say um, anything that would prevent this from states from passing these sorts of laws. On the other hand, it doesn't say anything that would allow them to pass such laws. So it doesn't prohibit, it doesn't allow, and it's kind of a black box. What is the electoral college? We kind of say it's obvious now because we've done it so many times. We've had 45 presidents, and we've had elections now for almost 250 years. But I don't think it actually is quite that obvious. Um, I think the Supreme Court decision is fine. Again, because it's simply a black box, and what was the original? If we're taking it from a textual perspective, I don't know that you could rule that there's any strong basis to prohibit the states from doing this. And this is largely left up to the states to decide how they choose their electors and so on. So that seems fair. That seems on the level. And if you want to talk about original intent. I mean, originally, a lot of these electors were chosen by state legislatures, or they might be chosen by the governor and his cabinet, something like that, depending on which state you're talking about. And so when we talk about original intent of the electoral college, I mean, it's obviously very flexible. The fact that we've gone from legislatures choose electors, and it's usually a split decision within a state, to now it's the voters choose the electors, and it's winner take all, except in Nebraska and Maine. That's a pretty wide shift, and I think it shows you that the Constitution gives states a lot of latitude. Now, what I think would be a really interesting case is there has been talk about making the electoral college um, well, a lot of states want to apportion their delegates instead of based on the state election. And this decision specifically talks about the state election. So if the voters in your state vote for, say, Donald Trump, then your electors are bound for Donald Trump. But what happens if you decide you want to bind the electors to the national popular vote, which is an idea that's out there, and a lot of state legislatures have passed laws to do exactly that. And it kicks in when a majority of states, or when a majority of the Electoral College has ratified laws or constitutional amendments to that effect. Now that's really interesting. And so this decision does not approach that. I would say, honestly, this decision isn't going to have a huge effect because we've never had an election swung by faithless electors ever. We've had faithless electors. Ron Paul won, I think, 1 or 2 electoral votes in Texas, because it's a big state and, it's the state party chooses the electors. In Washington, some of Hillary's electors defected in 2016, some for Colin Powell, some for people who weren't on the ballot. I think her name was like Linda Eaglefeather or something. So that can happen. That absolutely can happen. You can have faithless electors, but it has never mattered. Where it will matter is if this applies to NPV, National Popular Vote, and if the states pass it, and I think they will eventually, because there's a big groundswell out there for NPV. A lot of voters don't like the idea of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem fair to them. One man, one vote. I don't agree with that. I think the founding fathers set this up this way for a reason. But I think that's where we might be going. And so this case may be a little bit of a preview that the states have a lot of latitude to do things that maybe aren't so wise with how they make decisions, simply because the Supreme Court doesn't have the authority to second guess them, not because it's good or bad.
Yeah, I do want to just mention that there is another interpretation as far as intent of the framers that specifically deals with the idea that they actually wanted the possibility of faithless electors, simply because they didn't trust the individual citizens necessarily with the election of the president. That's one of the intentions of the Electoral College. It's one of the more, I guess, controversial aspects of the Electoral College is that the framers of the Constitution simply were not in any way comfortable with the popular vote of the president, period. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that there is that interpretation, which would actually advocate for the idea of faithless electors more so, I think, that it actually argues, the other way around.
Sure.
But like I said, this is an evolving story. This just came out. This literally is like breaking news. So there's going to be probably a lot more information coming out, a lot more commentary coming out about this, probably just in the coming hours.
Yeah, I would argue, which you just said, I've heard that as well. And I know, that's usually people on the left who say that. I would say that is definitely a myth, that it's about not having faith in the people, or it wasn't about the people. It wasn't like the founding fathers thought that the people were stupid or anything. It was a matter of the federal government is a creation of the states. And so the head of the federal government is accountable to the states. So the states get to choose who the electors are. That's the general idea. It wasn't making it sort of the people versus the elites. I think is the framing that people on the left who don't like the idea of Republican institutions want to use, but I don't know that it really has a strong basis in historical fact.
Well, I'd say that there's even another argument to that, but I don't want to get stuck on this because I've got more news briefs. So
All right, fair enough.
On the next one that I have here, because again, I've got some stuff that's really just breaking right now that I thought was quite interesting. I think I'll stop with this one. So this is from it looked like the Atlanta Journal, and it says Governor Kemp of Georgia is to deploy 1,000 National Guard troops after a violent weekend, and I wasn't even aware what exactly had happened. It said Governor Brian Kemp will deploy as many as 1,000 Georgia National Guard troops to protect state buildings in Atlanta on Monday, following a burst of violence across the city that left 4 dead, including an 8-year-old girl, and saw the ransacking of the headquarters of the Georgia State Patrol. It's just funny because there's so much going on right now. It's like this somehow didn't even register. This violent weekend in Georgia didn't even register because there's just so many things going on constantly. There's so many things going on in my own community, in my state. I can't keep track of everything. But what's relevant about this is that the article talks about the rift between Governor Kemp and also the mayor of Atlanta. And we see this in a lot of places because Georgia is one of those places where you have a Republican governor, but its largest city has a Democrat mayor. That's Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. We see the same thing in Arizona. In Arizona, we have a Republican governor. Our largest city, though, Phoenix, has a mayor who is a Democrat. And they are constantly at odds about things such as Corona, you name it. They just come at things differently, sometimes in a very partisan fashion. And so you kind of sometimes have these issues where it looks like you might have a little bit of a showdown going on between the governor and the mayor. Interestingly enough, the place you actually see this the most is in New York. And that goes back, hundreds of years practically between the rivalry between Albany and New York City. And you even see that even though Cuomo and de Blasio are both Democrats, they're constantly at odds with each other because it doesn't seem like they personally like each other. And again, there's that historical rivalry between Albany and New York City. And so you kind of see the same thing happening here in Atlanta. And so the fingers go back and forth about, you're doing overreach, you're not really doing the right thing, blah, 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 blah. So it's just kind of interesting to see that conflict between the state and its subdivision, in this case, a major city. And basically, sometimes they can't seem to come to terms about the best way to deal with these things. Now, reading this article, I will say that it looks like the National Guard deployment is actually quite limited. It said they will be dispatched to 3 locations in Atlanta. That's going to be the state capitol, which has been the focus of protests over statues of segregationists and Civil War leaders, the governor's mansion, and also the actual vandalized Department of Public Safety building in Southeast Atlanta. So it looks like the National Guard is going to be used more as a security detail as opposed to actually being out in the community involved with any kind of enforcement or anything like that. But still, it's a very substantial deployment. And again, there's sort of a history of states having these rivalries between the governors and large cities. Were you aware of this, Pete? Aware that this was going on?
No, this is the first time hearing about it, and honestly, I didn't realize that Atlanta was the capital of Georgia. A lot of states, I just had to look it up. It is in fact the capital of Georgia. A lot of states try to keep the capital outside of the major city. I think largely for reasons like this, so that because what the problem is that what the mayor does directly impacts the governor. If the governor were in Savannah, Georgia, for example, then an incident like this, that wouldn't necessarily be his turf. But yeah, I do think it's interesting. It sounds like things have kind of gotten out of control recently. If he feels the need to do this.
Well, again, there's a huge parallel there between my home state of Arizona and Georgia in that regard as well, because of course the capital of Arizona is Phoenix, and that is the largest city in the state as well. And I think you were touching on something that I think I've thought about quite a bit, which is, as you mentioned, that a lot of states, it almost seems like they purposely make sure that the capital is not in the most populous city.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought about that quite a bit. Arizona, actually, its capital has changed multiple times throughout its history.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Prescott was a capital at one time.
Yes.
The capital has changed. And I think a lot like Prescott in particular, how that would kind of be interesting if Prescott was still the capital of Arizona.
Right.
Because I actually like that town quite a bit. I have a good friend that lives there. But I just think it would be interesting if that was the case. And then you kind of wonder how these protests would go. Because, like, for instance, in the Phoenix protests, you had some protests that were going to the state capitol, but then you had other protests that were going to the Phoenix police headquarters. And so how would you split that if they weren't like practically next door neighbors. They're only a few blocks away from each other. Essentially, you can walk from the headquarters of the Phoenix Police Station to the state capitol. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. And I do, in my mind, also wonder if it might be better if we had just left the state capitol in Prescott, in Arizona's case, and if Georgia is having some of those same kind of issues because of the fact that the capital is in the largest city.
Yeah, and it could be because Phoenix wasn't a large city in the 1950s. It could be that the city grew up because it was the capital, and maybe that would have happened in Prescott too. We don't know. But the classic example of where this could cause a problem would be like in Washington, D.C., which is governed by Congress. You don't want the mayor of D.C. able to harass Congress. And you don't want the mayor of Atlanta able to directly influence the state government and in some way override the will of the people. And in this case, it sounds like that's not what's happening at all. It sounds like that the governor might be stepping on the mayor's toes a bit.
I will mention, by the way, that this article also talks about the mayor of Atlanta has tested positive for the coronavirus, and she actually may be sort of incapacitated at this point. This article kind of alludes to the fact that they couldn't get a new comment from her. So, either way, either side of the political aisle you're on, prayers for her. But the bottom line is that adds fuel to the fire, literally. That whole situation. So.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. Although, what's kind of amazing is we've heard about staffers, we've heard about Secret Service, we've heard about people around the president, around congressmen, and we haven't had some congressmen. Rand Paul had coronavirus, but it's almost surprising that we haven't had more, high-profile politicians. But I guess Boris Johnson test positive, given how widespread it seems to be.
Oh well, we had an activist, here locally in the Phoenix metro area that recently tested positive for corona.
Right.
Which
And I was gonna say these politicians spend all of their time in crowds. It seems like they'd be more vulnerable than other people.
Yeah, I would think so as well. Absolutely.
So, do we have any more news briefs, Eric?
No, I know that you have quite a few stories that you want to talk about. Did you want to start out?
All right.
You said with on justice reform.
Sure. Let me just cue that up. We've seen. We saw just fairly recently that Donald Trump signed into not law exactly, but he signed an executive order regarding criminal justice reform. And this is one of those stories where you kind of wonder where the reporters are coming from. It says it's a scoop, which means that it doesn't say who in the White House is saying this. There's a lot of unnamed sources. And I was trying to find out because Axios, I don't know if you're familiar with them as a news organization, but they usually play it pretty straight. They're not far left. They're certainly not far right. It seems like they're just trying to be like the AP or Reuters, just reporting the news. But when I looked into who runs the website, all the founders come from Politico. They all have left-leaning alliances. But regardless, what I thought was interesting was they have and the White House. And a lot of people, believe that Jared has a great deal of influence in the White House. He certainly seems to. They gave him a lot of responsibility that we talked about last week with regards to the Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they're saying here, and I'd heard that Ivanka was involved, so I guess it makes sense that Jared would be involved in this one as well. That he was the one who pushed for criminal justice reform a few years ago, and that there's some alleged strong language from the president, basically calling him woke, calling him a lefty, and that's sort of the divide that they're trying to set up here. That these reporters are trying to set up here. What do you think? How credible do you think this is, Eric?
Well, I think Trump has a really interesting record on criminal justice reform. I actually did a micro episode myself a couple of weeks ago when Trump's executive order first came out. I was taking a look at it, what it actually said.
Right.
And it's interesting because it dealt with one of the major issues that people have been talking about and say that they want, and that's important, which is specifically certification, different, sort of more, I guess, nationalized certification standards, which I don't know how I feel about that. And then also information sharing, which I think almost has universal backing. That's the idea that if you kind of screw up in one department, you're not going to be able to hide in another one because they don't realize what you did. So you want to keep like a national database, especially for things like use of force incidents. If you have a use of force complaint, they want that complaint to travel with you if you apply to a different agency. I think that's very reasonable, very reasonable. So that's one of the things that the executive order addressed. But of course, prior to all this, people famously remember Kanye West, going to the White House. The entire reason that Kanye West was going to the White House was because his wife is a big advocate of criminal justice reform. And that's something that they were trying to address with Donald Trump. And as far as I could see, Donald Trump seemed very favorable to the idea of things like changing sentencing guidelines, maybe loosening things like, the three strikes and you're out standard, which, by the way, these things all come from the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was the one that backed these things and started these things in the first place. And a lot of people have been talking about this because, we have a huge prison population. Largest prison population per capita, I believe, in the world, even in excess of China, when you're talking per capita. So we have mass incarceration, and that's something that I think a lot of us, especially on the Liberty side, are concerned about. And Trump has been very sympathetic, I think, towards that issue. And in terms of advocating that, yeah, we do need some reform on this issue. So I think Trump has a really interesting record when it comes to criminal justice reform. And, I've made the argument many times, especially in my personal life, and I've said it on the program at least once. I don't necessarily regard Trump as a quote unquote conservative. So I think he is more receptive to some of these ideas than say your quote unquote typical Republican.
Yeah, you brought up some good points. First of all, he does seem to have a close relationship with Rand Paul. Rand Paul has been a big supporter of his, even when they don't disagree. He's always expressed his disagreements very respectfully of the president and seems to be able to work with him in a way that other senators, other politicians in general, have not been able to do. So that makes me a little suspicious because this was one of Rand Paul's issues. And so the idea that he would just turn on not just Jared, but sort of implicitly turn on Rand Paul, just, I don't know, something about that doesn't quite ring true. They're very close. And the other thing that you mentioned was the executive order. So the timing of this, I don't see how the timeline really makes sense on this. That he was in favor of criminal justice reform, or at least Jared made him do it, allegedly, okay, according to this article. And then the George Floyd incident happens. You have unrest, you have protests, you have riots, and so you think, okay, that's going to be the thing that turns him against criminal justice reform. But then he goes ahead after that and signs an executive order that goes further than the law. I mean, not that it violates the law, but it's in addition to it augments the law. I guess you would say. So yeah, this normally I think Axios's reporting is very solid, but something about this it seems like it's first of all, the fact that it's anonymous sources, which means that if it is false, they're not as worried about blowback, at least not publicly, unless they're outed later for having fed false information to a reporter. I don't see that happening. So yeah, this will be interesting to see if we hear about this again, but we might not. This may be just fake news that's out there. But I thought it was at least interesting
Well,
because it's a very complex dynamic.
Scenario, Pete. I do want to give one other scenario.
Okay.
Which on the last program we talked about John Bolton, and this might be the Boltonization of justice reform for Trump, very much like his foreign policy. Remember, Trump campaigned on a non-interventionist foreign policy, And he said he wanted to get the troops out of Afghanistan, and then it didn't happen because basically his advisor said that was a terrible idea, and then he backed away from that. We know that he got into multiple conflicts with John Bolton over a lot of different security issues, and we also know that John Bolton came very much from that establishment crowd of Republicans that quite frankly are hawks, from that sort of hawk section of the party, which is very traditional within the Republican Party. There's that section is there. It's been there for a long time. Likewise, there is a section of the Republican Party that is, very pro law and order, very pro police. Trump himself is very pro police. He's a very pro police individual. But I can see sort of if I don't know what other way to call it, sort of the deep state of the Republican Party, if they kind of are saying, hey, you've gone too far, and we need to reverse direction here. I don't know who else besides, say, Rand Paul. Rand Paul's a good example. I don't know who else is whispering in Trump's ear in the other direction if somebody comes to him like that. You know what I mean? If there's a significant block of sort of connected people and advisors who say, hey, you're too soft on this. This is not going to work well. It's not going to play well. Whatever they're saying to him. I kind of wonder who's on the other side that would kind of bring him back and say, no, you've been doing good on this. We just need to keep going in that direction.
Yeah, well, Rand Paul and Mike Lee obviously are in favor of criminal justice reform, and you're right. It's hard to say who would be against it, and there's really no tension here. Just like there's no tension between having an America First foreign policy and saying that we need to be involved in fewer wars. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but it can be something of a balancing act. How do you balance those competing interests? Um, and so, law and order versus criminal justice reform. If you think of criminal justice reform as being anti-police, which is, I think, a mistake, because that shouldn't be ever the goal should never be to undermine the police or undermine the rule of law. It should be to uphold the rule of law by making sure that everybody is accountable, that the law is applied fairly to police officers, and so making sure that the records follow them. That's kind of in that vein. That doesn't undermine the rule of law at all. It's just about accountability. So yeah, this my gut tells me this might be fake news, just because it's talking about what is ultimately a false conflict.
That very well could be the case. It certainly wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think that pretty much covers that, because we just don't know yet, right? Until we have more information, we can speculate, but we really don't know. Um, so I wanted to talk about Arizona has been in the news for coronavirus, because as you may know, we opened up not so long ago. How long ago did Arizona open up, Eric? Was it 3 weeks ago?
That sounds right. I don't have the statistic right in front of me, unfortunately.
Okay.
So I
So
don't know when that happened.
yeah, it seemed like it was about 3 weeks ago that Arizona opened up, and they opened up restaurants, they opened up bars, they opened up gyms, they opened up everything, and things were kind of going great. But if you look at the deaths, about 2 weeks ago, and that's right here, we jumped from 21 deaths per day to 32 deaths per day, which is about a 50% increase almost overnight. And here we've been trending down for let's see, over a month, about 6 weeks prior to that, and then there's a quick jump, and then suddenly we're on an upward trajectory, and and then we shut down again. And what's really interesting is that when we shut down, there was an immediate. Now maybe it's backfill, maybe these but actually I don't think that would even affect it. We've just seen another drop um, in the deaths, and it's a noticeable. It looks like a real momentum shift. But it couldn't. But you see, the problem is that it couldn't react that fast. Deaths are not going to drop off a day or two after the lockdown goes into effect, and yet that's kind of what this chart implies. So I think it's interesting. Maybe what we saw was a short spike, but ultimately it wasn't sustainable. There weren't that many people who were going to be infected, And a lot of the people who have died from it, as we know, are elderly. A lot of the people who are getting it now, a lot of the new cases, are younger people. And so, maybe what this tells us is that we really have passed the peak here in Arizona. It's hard for me to really wrap my head around this data, because there are all kinds of oddities. We have sort of a lag in how we're getting the death data. So often, but yeah, yeah, I'm just not sure what to make of this. It seems like this breaks all existing political narratives, as far as I can tell. This doesn't make anybody look genius. What do you think?
Well, the funny thing is,
Eric, are you there?
yeah, I'm here. You able to hear me? Okay. I think we were having a little bit of a lag there with the stream. Um, are you able to hear me, Pete?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. We were having a little bit of a technical lag there, but I think there's always that funny saying, which it sounds great. Say numbers don't lie. Well, sometimes they do. Because numbers are nothing more than another data point, and sometimes the data is incorrect, and sometimes it's not tabulated correctly. And that is one of the problems that we have when we talk about corona and saying numbers don't lie, or look at the numbers. Well, how are you tabulating this? For instance, is we this has been in the news quite a bit. How much of an effect does the increased testing have on these numbers? How much does other factors like that? Also, in terms of deaths, one of the things that they'll talk about is sometimes it looks like you're having a downward trend in deaths, but you're really not, because of the lag, because there's a lag time between, obviously, incubation, infection, and actually dying from this thing. So all these numbers sometimes don't mean exactly what we think they mean. And remember, it's not set. Like, you talk about the incubation period of COVID. Some people will get sick within 2 days of exposure, and they'll test positive after 2 days after exposure. Some people don't show any symptoms for 2 weeks, as long as 2 weeks. So that has a huge effect on statistics, because you could have, theoretically, this whole group of people that have not been tested, that have been exposed, that are going to die even from this infection or get seriously ill. Well, they're not showing up on this graph at all right now. So that's kind of one of the problems with COVID, is especially when you look at it from day to day, and even from week to week sometimes, is those little gaps in the data, they're hard to account for. Pete, I think your mic is muted again.
Yes, it is. Yeah, so to just sort of piggyback on that, if you look at the number of tests here, or the number of daily new cases, clearly this is affected by the number of tests, because we're seeing a huge spike in the number of daily new cases, but we're not seeing a large spike, even if you account for lag, in the number of deaths. And so what this shows you is that the 7-day rolling average of daily new cases is largely tainted. Maybe it seems that we might have peaked here at the in the past couple days, although it's a little premature to say that definitively. In fact, it's premature to. What we do know is that there's been no attempt. We don't know the infection rate. We don't seem to know anything. It's just been an ongoing problem that many months into this crisis, our leaders at every level have failed to provide meaningful data, provide meaningful answers as to how deadly this is, how infectious it is. I we locked down. We talked about how we had these emergency orders that the governors passed out because the legislature didn't have time to react. Well, you know, it also applies to citizens. We have no idea how to react because we went along with the lockdown. We did everything that was asked of us as a country. But then the people who were in charge, who are supposed to sort of get a handle on the scope of this problem, have spent months doing nothing. Apparently, they've spent months just not being able to get any kind of visibility on the scope or the severity of this problem, and it's just mind blowing.
Well, one of the things
Just mind blowing.
that I find, when you talk about those kinds of issues, one of the things that I think is really upsetting and disturbing is when you talk about countries like, say, South Korea that have done an excellent job managing COVID. Um, they always identify clusters. In other words, when they see any kind of a spike, they'll be able to tell you this is why. They'll actually say it's because of this nightclub. It's because of this church assembly. It's because of this concert. There was early in the epidemic, there was a concert I remember they had in South Korea, and they were attributing the COVID tests to that. The reason is because they have excellent contact tracing. So they're able to say this is where the cluster is. Contrast that with, say, Arizona, where, for instance, Governor Ducey slammed multiple clubs and nightclubs and things like that and said they were bad actors and they were being irresponsible. But he didn't give us any data to back up that claim. He didn't say, yes, we're seeing a cluster from these nightclubs from Old Town or whatever. I never saw any data that indicated that they were showing anything like that. Now, part of that, of course, I'm sure gets into lawsuits and HIPAA and things like that, but it is a key part of the equation here. If we really are seeing a spike from a certain area, from say a concert, from a theater, Pete, you and I got into it about the 2 theaters that were open, for a little bit. Well, if we're really seeing a spike from these places, well, tell us, show us the data, say this is where it's coming from, and that's why we have to shut it down, because that's what they did in South Korea. I don't see why we can't do
Right.
that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's political resistance, and I think there's political incompetence to contact tracing. That's been my observation.
Well, it's definitely something that you just don't hear a lot about. I mean, and that's not
Right.
just Arizona. You just don't hear about that. You don't hear about clusters.
Oh yeah.
That they just. I think I saw one article where they were attributing some, and I believe it was in the South or somewhere they're attributing an outbreak to a church, and that's the only time you hear about it. By the way, at least that for me, the only time I've ever heard anything is, oh well, it's a church's fault, but you don't hear anything about what's going on with these protesters. And of course, you have to ask yourself: do they say that? I mean, when they're, because they're supposed to be giving you questions, they're supposed to be doing contact tracing, so that's something that should be coming up. But how is that treated? And you wonder if is it given equal weight to the fact that somebody went to church? And you have to ask yourself: is it, or is it being politicized? Because if it's science, it doesn't matter whether you got it at a protest or you got it at a church. We just need to know where you got it. It doesn't, but that's not what's happening. I think a lot of this is being politicized.
Yeah, I agree. It's been politicized, and it just we haven't seen our alleged leaders stand up. They're more interested in grandstanding than in actually doing something to address these problems. So very very unfortunate. Well, I'd like to kind of move on to the next one, which was we're finishing up all of our episodes with a book report now. So so the book of this week is The Deficit Myth, which just came out, and I don't know if you've heard of Stephanie Kelton, Eric.
I have not. I'm not
Okay.
familiar with her.
Stephanie Kelton was Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor, and she was how do I put it? She also advised the Senate Democrat on on economic issues, and she is a proponent of an economic theory called modern monetary theory, which I think is it's very interesting because we've talked a lot about some certain disconnects between what the experts say and what we're observing. And the fact that economic theory hasn't in many cases quite caught up with economic reality. And there are some shortcomings with this book, to be sure, but I think it was some of her insights were really interesting. Queue up a few of these quotations because I think it's kind of surprising the overlap that we see between the left and the right. As much as we talk about the disagreements, but the overlap is perhaps even more interesting. If you could bring up the first quote, here's the thing that she's mostly arguing against, which was the idea that deficits are evidence of overspending. So she's kind of making fun of Senator Enzi, who was a business owner from, I believe, it's either Wyoming or Montana. He was a shoe salesman, and she just couldn't believe that he thought that the reason why we have deficits is because we spend too much. It seems like that's pretty self-evident. Uh, but well, I'd ask you, where do you think she's going with this? Just the title of the book, the deficit myth. I think it kind of clues you in that she thinks that the idea that overspending is dangerous is something of a myth.
Well, there's a lot of people that think that on both sides of the aisle. That's probably one of the most nonpartisan issues there is. That's why I argue that nonpartisanism is not always a good thing, because both parties agree that we should spend ourselves into oblivion.
Right. Well, yeah, Dick Cheney was the one who said deficits don't matter. So if this guy Enzi is from Wyoming, and I think he is, they both be from the same state, but be on completely different issues of this. So if you could cue up the next thing. Now, this was the thing that I thought was really interesting. Now, you and I have talked about how the left wing Economic Policy Institute, the EPI, has that amazing chart of how productivity and wages have diverged, and she sort of ties together why that is. Since about 1971, 72, 73 is when that divergence started. It became really obvious or really apparent in 1973. What she blames it on here is essentially that when uh, unemployment goes up, they start hiking rates in order to keep inflation at bay, as she says. And that term Nairu is like the level of, like, the minimum. Think of it as like the minimum amount of unemployment you can have before you have inflation. Now, what's that?
No, I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay. I thought it sounded like you had something to say there. Yeah, but I think that's an interesting idea, and this is kind of the key of, like, the Bernie Sanders crowd's economic thinking. That until you start seeing inflation, you haven't spent enough. That's I mean the key thesis, the core thesis of this book. Um,
Well, we've argued on this, or I've argued for this on this program, that inflation isn't exactly what people think it is, or it's not
mhm.
what they're telling us it is. I think of that line from The Princess Bride, which is the film that I enjoyed a lot as a kid. I've watched it many times, and there's this famous line: "I don't think that word means what you think it means." I
Right.
feel like that's what inflation has become, because we've talked about this before in terms of, there are so many things like the cost of a house. Here, we'll just take that as an example, right? The cost of a house. And when you compare that to the level of people's incomes today as to what they were, say, 40, 50 years ago, it just, there's no comparison. It was much easier to buy a house back then, even though, we're told that we don't have massive inflation. Think of healthcare. That's a great one. And that's one where the Sanders people are kind of they're obviously talking out of both ends of their mouth. You're telling me there's no inflation in healthcare compared to, say, 40, 50 years ago, when most people didn't have health insurance, but they would just go to the local doctor and just pay them? And you're saying there's no inflation in healthcare? I recently had to go to the ER, and I recently got my bill, and I have insurance, and my bill was substantial, but you should see the charges that they had on there. And I went in there for a simple procedure because I needed stitches. So I'm just telling you, that's not inflation. Of course it's inflation, because what it means is that your money power is going down. But it doesn't affect everything, because, for instance, we can talk about manufacturing. And manufacturing tends to keep going down, 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 down. Why? Because of automation. Eventually, manufacturing is going to cost almost nothing because you're not going to need hardly even a single human being to be involved with the process. Once you get that manufacturing plant up, you're talking about pennies for some of these items. It's just the cost of materials. The cost of labor is always the most expensive. So we kind of have these different things happening at the same time. So I can go and buy really cheap stuff at Walmart, and I think that my money power is pretty good. And in that respect, it is, because I can buy a lot of stuff. I can go to Walmart. I can go to the dollar store. I can almost buy the entire store, and get a lot of actually pretty good products, because I go to the dollar store all the time, and you can actually get some pretty good stuff there, and it's $1. But that's because the cost of manufacturing keeps going down. But if I want to buy a new house, you know what I mean? Depending on what my lifestyle is, that might be a tricky position with my current income. And that's why it's sort of inflation, I think, doesn't mean the same things to everyone, and we don't put it across the board. As far as it's not just all one thing anymore. It's not just that number they tell us it is. It's reflected in other things.
Inflation. I think it's certainly not even anymore. I'm not sure that it ever was evenly distributed. If you could bring up the next quote, here's where I think it gets really interesting when it says she talks about President Nixon's decision to suspend dollar convertibility increased money sovereignty to the United States, forever changing the nature of the relative constraint on federal spending. Under the Bretton Woods system, the federal budget had to be fairly tightly controlled to protect the nation's gold reserves. Now, what does that mean? In 1971, about the time that wages diverged from productivity, was when we went off the gold standard. Now, you and I made this observation, and that's kind of where I was going with this, that she looks at that and says, okay, since 1971, the Federal Reserve has been able to preempt inflation by raising rates. And what happens is every time wages start to go up, they raise rates, which crushes wages back down. Oftentimes, it'll cause us to go into a little bit of a recession. And so there are a couple of lessons we can learn from that. One would be, well, we need to have stable money. We need to get the Fed out of interest rates and allow the free market to do its magic, so to speak. But the lesson that she takes is exactly the opposite. Yes, we should get rid of the Federal Reserve because it's being used to constrain wages and by extension inflation. But that this was a good thing that we got away from the gold standard, and so now we should let Congress basically decide how much money there is. Forget monetary policy, forget interest rates. If we don't have enough inflation, or if we have too much unemployment, just turn on the spigots. And if you ask her why this wouldn't create massive inflation, even though by definition it is inflation to create more money like this, printing money is inflation. And she, again, she would quibble with that definition there. But in essence, her response is, this isn't taking resources out of circulation. This is taking resources that are on the side, people who are unemployed, and putting them back into the workforce, taking resources that are going fallow, not being used, and putting them to use. What do you think about that, Eric?
Well, we've talked about this before too. A story that I've told you many times, but some of our listeners may not have heard before, is that back in the days of the Arizona Liberty Caucus, I would attend political rallies and I would film them. And I went to a Bernie Sanders rally to film his rally, and I wore an End the Fed shirt. And I got a lot of compliments on my End the Fed shirt. But the problem is, so oftentimes, and I see this with libertarians, especially big L libertarians, all the time. They'll take an issue like, for instance, police reform. That's very topical right now. And they'll think, oh, wow, this is awesome. There's all these lefties that are supporting my view now. And I'm getting great hits on my Twitter, and this is awesome. And they're totally with me in police reform. Guys, they don't think of police reform the same way you do. And this is the same thing with what we're talking about right now. And the Fed doesn't mean the same thing to a lot. I'm not going to say all, but to a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters and to Bernie Sanders himself, as evident in this book. It doesn't mean the same thing as it means to Ron Paul and to our side. it means different things. They have different agendas, different goals than the rest of us. And so we think that there's sort of a commonality. Hey, we have a common cause. We both want to audit the Fed. Well, they want to audit the Fed for very different reasons than why we want to audit the Fed. And I think we fall into this trap all the time because there's a certain naivete when it comes to people on our side, people that advocate for liberty. Like I said, especially I see it with big L libertarians all the time, that they don't quite understand that philosophically they're coming from a very different place. They think because, quote unquote, the end goal is the same. Guys, that's not the end goal. They're just getting started. That's our end goal. We just want to go there. We don't want to go any further than that. No, they have another agenda after that. After they get rid of the Fed, they're going to replace it. Guess what? After they get rid of the police, they're going to replace it, folks. That's the bottom line. So that's not their end goal. That's my point. They have another reason. They have another agenda beyond that.
Right. Yeah. So her position is not that we should end the Fed and go back to commodity money, go back to, say, the gold standard. She's very vociferous in opposing that kind of thing. She believes that it was great that we got away from the gold standard, that it unshackled us, that it freed us to explore different policy options. And in a certain sense, I think it's factually true. The menu of policy options that we have, whether they're good or bad, for better or for worse, have expanded. But really, what she's talking about is politicizing the powers that the Federal Reserve currently has, taking them away from the Federal Reserve and giving them largely to Congress, getting away from monetary policy as the way that we prime the pump, that we try to stimulate the economy during a recession, and going to fiscal stimulus, meaning that we simply spend a lot of money put directly in people's hands. So it's not even it's almost not even a matter of will inflation happen. It's almost like by definition inflation. Whereas when the federal what's that?
You're hitting the nail on the head. So you're basically just reshuffling the deck. It's not like our side that says, hey, nobody should have this power. She's just saying, let's put the power in somebody else's hands. That's just reshuffling the deck. So you're not changing anything. You're just changing who ultimately makes the call, right? Now would I argue that perhaps it makes more sense for Congress to have that power, since that's kind of what Congress is supposed to do? I don't know, maybe. But my argument is more along the lines of nobody should have this power. This is an overreach. This is tyranny. We shouldn't be doing this to begin with. Shuffling the deck and putting it into somebody else's hands, that's kind of like the old argument that, oh, if only Hitler was a good guy, and then he could have accomplished so many good things. No, there's that argument. It's actually from a Star Trek episode. There's that argument.
Oh, okay.
If only Hitler was a good man, he could have used that system because he did do good things. For instance, Nazi Germany had 100% employment far before the United States did. There were things that he did that were efficient and that were quote unquote good. And the argument is, well, if Hitler had been a better person, that would have worked better. That system would have worked better. The problem is the system itself was inherently corrupt. Power corrupts. That's the problem. Right. So when you shuffle the deck, you're not changing anything. That's my point.
I see your point now. It doesn't matter who has the power. It's the fact that they have that kind of power that attracts those sorts of leaders in the first place. We see the violence inherent in the system. Could you cue up the next quotation here? Now, this is what I thought was really interesting. This is something that some Tea Party leaders even took a bit of an interest in. Not this whole thing, but during the 2008 crisis, she urged the Obama administration to enact a robust stimulus, meaning spend a lot of money, print money, hand it out, throw it out of a helicopter, calling for a payroll tax holiday, which I think Trump and the Republican Congress have called for as well. I don't know. I don't think they've passed that into law, but that's certainly a proposal that has been bandied about, that we get rid of the payroll tax, at least temporarily, because the people being hit hardest, of course, are the people who are living paycheck to paycheck. So a regressive tax like this would make sense to suspend, perhaps. But okay. She wants additional aid for state and local governments. You can kind of understand, because state and local governments cannot print money in the way the federal government can have. And the final one I think is really interesting is the federal job guarantee. Now, I don't know about the federal part, But think about in practical terms what a job guarantee is. That right now, if somebody's out of work, they go on unemployment or they go on welfare, and which she's advocating essentially is that, imagine if a condition of going on welfare, if you're an able-bodied person, is that you have to, work at the state park or the national park or whatever, you're painting a wall or something. You are you are returning some value to society in exchange for receiving those benefits. What do you think about that as an idea?
Well, on the surface of it, I'm not opposed to it. I like the idea of people that are on welfare actually doing something. I think that concept actually, um, it's sort of better than what we have now. Um, just the basic concept on it on its face, I think is interesting. Uh, but then again, I'm someone that's not a big advocate for welfare to begin with. So it's kind of like, am I going to get bait, get baited and switched, that kind of a thing?
Right.
Because again, like I mentioned before, I think their end goal is very different than mine. I don't want
Mhm.
anybody to be on welfare. That's the bottom line. I understand that
Yeah.
there are situations where they need it. I'm also a federalist and think that that's something the state should be taking care of if they decide to, and if the people of that state
Mhm.
decide to, rather than the federal government being the primary engine of that. And I do understand you were touching upon the fact that obviously the federal government can print money, the states can't, and that's kind of why the system is the way it is right now. But as
Mhm.
a constitutionalist and a federalist, I would argue that it's the state's obligation or the state's decision, amongst the people to decide whether they want to do welfare. I don't think it should
Right.
be in the federal government's hands to begin with. But I do
Mhm.
like the idea that if we're going to have some sort of welfare program, that you would have to do something to earn it. That you couldn't just sit at home and watch TV and get your welfare check.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing that's really interesting is it's not just. I mean, obviously she's coming in from a leftist perspective. So again, hitting that topic of here's an interesting point of intersection, but we're coming at it from completely different directions. She's looking at it less from the perspective of it's a matter of justice. You shouldn't be sitting at home, but which is kind of the more people on the right might look at it that way. But from the perspective of if somebody is out of work for 3 months or 6 months or a year and they're collecting welfare in the meantime, it gets harder and harder the longer they're out of work to get back into the labor force because a potential employer will say, "Hey, you haven't worked in 6 months. What's the deal? What's the problem? Don't you show up to work?" That kind of thing. And so her thinking is that this would reduce structural unemployment because those people who can work, but through for whatever reason they get sick or they just can't find a job for 3 months, they don't end up staying out of the labor market, the private labor market longer than they have to, simply because they no longer have a track record of work. They don't have any references to fall back on. Um, and so that kind of gets to kind of tying her whole theory together, which is that the reason why she believes in all this stimulus is to make sure that resources, especially human resources, that are on the sidelines, that they're in the marketplace. They're not outside of the marketplace. We don't have all this potential that's being wasted because human life is finite. These working years, if they're gone, they're gone. Um, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the major problems with welfare, as we see it in its current manifestation, and of course it's changed over time. Bill Clinton did some actual major welfare reform during his administration, but it's kind of interesting if you listen to stories or if you know some people that have been on welfare or needed it. It's interesting to hear their stories. Like I had a friend who basically was a single mother, and during her the early parts of the infancy of her child, she got hurt. She had no other means of support, and she applied for welfare and basically was denied on the grounds that eventually she would be healthy again and be able to go back to work. But what does that tell you? That tells you that they don't want you to go back to work. They want you to perpetually be part of the welfare state and not support yourself and basically be beholden to the state for the rest of your life. and there are clearly bureaucrats and clearly policies out there that push that push that. That's just one story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens is a lot of times you can kind of see that welfare becomes about dependency, and it's not really about that helping hand to lift somebody up, which is the way that it's been kind of sold to us. With
Hmm.
LBJ's Great Society, that's how it was sold to us. Hey, we're just giving these people an extra hand, lifting them up. So because sometimes right now is a great example. There are circumstances beyond people's control. In my own neighborhood right now, there are many bars that are closed, and that means that those servers and bartenders cannot work. They cannot go to work
Hmm.
right now. So should they have some sort of access to welfare, especially when it's the government that basically shut down their business to begin with? I could advocate for that, but it's a temporary solution to eventually get them back to work. I think the problem is with welfare so often is there's no real push to get people back to work. They just want them perpetually to be in that dependent state for the rest of their lives.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't disagree with that. Oftentimes it's kind of like the private prisons dilemma, where if you incentivize people who own a business to increase the prison population, they have less of an incentive to rehabilitate the prisoners who are in their private prisons. But there was one other thing, and I don't have the quote up here, but it was kind of a doomsday prediction that, in fact, I'll just throw up. I have a picture of the Economist here, so you can see who we're talking about. Stephanie Kelton. She is, yeah, that is Bernie Sanders' advisor. She's a professor at Stony Brook College. But there was one real doomsday prediction in this book that I thought was really interesting, and that was, it doesn't matter if we privatize Social Security, in essence, is what she's saying. That if we do, and let's say you save 20% of your income every month, and at the end of 30, 40 years of doing that, you have enough in theory to retire on, you're set for life. What happens if there simply aren't enough working people and enough resources to support the retirees? Because the it's not like the food you produce during your working years, that's not there anymore.
This
Anything
is not
you
this is not a theoretical problem, by the way. Uh, this is what's also known sometimes as the demographic time bomb. Places like
Yeah.
Western Europe and Japan, they're looking at this as a real reality because when you have an aging population and you're not replacing your people at a certain rate, hey, this is one of those examples where the numbers really don't lie. Eventually, it's not going to be the fact that your one child is working for both parents. No, it's your one child working for both parents and four grandparents.
Hmm.
That's the kind of math we're looking at. That's one of the problems even in China. They have a demographic time bomb because of their one child policy, because that's exactly one of the big examples of this potential crisis. But Japan, their numbers look awful when it comes to this. In fact, I'll tell you, you know what their solution is, by the way, right? Do you know what Japan's solution is to that?
Is it euthanasia?
Wow. Hey, Japan's a democracy. Come on, Pete. No, their solution is technology. They want to build robots.
Oh,
That's
okay.
why you see. That's why Japan is at the forefront of humanoid robot development. Is because they plan to use robots to care for their elderly. That's their only solution
uh,
because they're not making enough Japanese. So,
right.
which is really sad.
No, yeah, I don't necessarily mean forced euthanasia, but I wouldn't be surprised anytime you have socialized medicine, there is a great incentive for to push people towards euthanasia for the so-called greater good. that that occurs sometimes. I mean, that occurs to some extent even in our society. But I wasn't being facetious about that. But yeah, I think technology can be a solution, and she does talk about that being at least a partial solution to the problem. But I think it is an interesting question. It doesn't matter how many dollars we have saved up when we retire. It does matter about the resources, and if there's not enough resources, then that could, as you called it, a demographic time bomb. And what we'll see in that case will essentially be inflation, one way or another, as we scramble to bid up the price of scarce resources.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That absolutely makes sense to me, because you can imagine someone who actually saved rather well, and say they have $500,000, they have $500,000, which sounds great. But if the cost of getting into a nursing home, for instance, is $100,000 a month, well, I guess you got 5 months to live, right?
Right. Yeah. So on that cheerful note, I do recommend you read the book because it is a different perspective. They do talk about inflation in quite a bit of detail, and they talk about different theories. And I think we have reached a point where we need to start exploring, the whole socialism capitalism thing. Socialism is dead. Marxism died. She is not a Marxist. She may be in favor of wild spending, but she is and nowhere says that we should get rid of money. We should get rid of markets as Marx intended. Um, and the fact that we haven't seen inflation, that our current theories of inflation seem to be deficient, I think means that whether she's right or wrong, the fact that she's courageous enough, she and Warren Mosler and Randall Wray are courageous enough to advance different theories is very necessary at this time because we can all see the ticking time bomb here on some of these issues, and we don't really have answers. So anyway, yeah, it's a good read. It just came out this month. A lot of people are talking about it, and it's a very approachable read. Believe it or not, it's if you've read any of Milton Friedman's stuff, it's kind of on that level, like capitalism and freedom. So it's certainly a very readable book. And with that, I would say I'm Pete Maines. This is my co-host Eric Alexander, and until next week, you keep flying free.